But we do have a great first speaker coming to the stage today that provides further evidence of the maturity of the gamification industry. When you see the smart money starting to chase deals, and Tim Chang of Mayfield Ventures is definitely an example of a visionary venture capitalist who's invested in a number of successful gaming companies, including Playdom and Badgeville, and he'll be talking to us today about the investment case for gamification. So please help me welcome Tim to the stage. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Tim.
Good to see you. Good afternoon, folks. Hopefully you can all hear me. No slides. I kind of get beaten down with slides for a living every day, and I didn't want to subject you to the same thing. So instead, we'll be doing jazz hands and interpretive dance. But what Gabe and the gang asked me to talk a little bit about was threats and opportunities, sort of the venture capital and investment viewpoint for what's going on with gamification. What are the new areas coming up? What are the trends? And also, what are the gotchas to watch out for? Is this a space that's starting to peak? Is there a lot of pushback already? Is it a fad? You know, is there still opportunity for startups to start and innovate in this area? Or is it already getting played out? You know, is it in space of consolidation already? So I'll talk a little bit about kind of the view from a VC perspective. But first, a little bit about why I kind of got into this area in the first place. 1980, I'm about 10 years old or so. My dad brings home an Apple II computer, and the first thing I say is, "Dad, I want to play games." And he says, "Well, there are none. It's such a new industry. There's no real game companies." So he chucks an AppleSoft Basic programming manual at me and says, "Make your own." And so that's kind of how I learned to program, was to make games. And that's why I actually got interested in things like math and science and all that, was basically for playing games. So how many of you are actually, would you consider yourselves gamers or gamer type folks at one point in time or another? So that's interesting, because not everybody was or would call themselves a gamer. I definitely was, but I grew up investing hundreds, if not thousands of hours in role-playing games, RPGs. And if you can picture these things, these are games like Wizardry or Ultima or Bard's Tale. And imagine crafting your virtual characters and spending dozens, if not hundreds of hours charting out the development path of how you want your virtual self to be. What skills would you pick up? What experiences and what achievements do you want to unlock? And you're actually mapping out, if I got 10 points, I'd assign 2 points to strength, 3 points to charisma, 2 points to intelligence. You're actually planning out how your virtual self is going to develop in this virtual world. And it was only 5-6 years ago, it kind of struck me, almost like a flash of the blinding obvious. How come we don't apply this to our own real self lives? It's not that different in the sense of, how would you map out your career path? What would you level up in? If there were equivalents of real life character classes, what would you be, right? In the game world, there's character classes like fighters, who are extra strong. There are wizards who aren't very strong physically but have high intelligence scores. How would you apply this to your real life self? And how would you map that out? And it just struck me that, man, that's not such a hard framework to use. And many of us do it implicitly, but the more explicit and the more real-time feedback is given to you at any point, the more useful all these kind of game-like frameworks could be. So that's kind of what got me interested in this area. And the other big learning was that all these mechanics we were using in companies like Playdom and NGMocha, which I had invested in, they were applicable for non-game purposes, right? So that started me thinking about the power of gamification about 3 years ago or so, and I mentioned these sort of things like metagaming or whatnot at GDC, and people kind of thought, oh, that's an interesting idea. But like all things that go through the hype curve, you ever seen the Gartner hype cycle, things pick up really quick, and I think we started seeing backlash against the G word, gamification, as quickly as we saw people blogging and talking about it. And there were a lot of folks saying, it's a fad, this is silly, and there's been just as much pushback as there has been support for the industry. And I think it's justifiable. So I'm not one of the kind of people who will say, it's taken over, it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I think it's always worth paying attention to why there's pushback and understanding where it comes from. And so I'm going to give you sort of my breakdown on where the pushback comes from and why it's valid and what the threats are to this burgeoning sector of gamification if we're not careful. I recently had the privilege of co-teaching a case study at Stanford Business School on Badgeville, along with Chris, the CEO there, and half the class was definitely very skeptical. They thought it was a fad, and when we asked the students why, they came back with a number one pushback that not everything should be a game. And then when you double-click down that a little bit and said, well, what does that mean? Why isn't it a game? It turns out that it might be a definition issue because most people equate game with fun. Funny part is, if you ever see hardcore game players playing a game, they have their brows very furrowed and they're really serious and they'll be muttering expletives and chucking controllers at the screen when they die. They don't look like they're actually having fun. They're pretty serious and they look like they're working really hard at it. And so it made me think that what if the definition of gamification is not necessarily about making everything fun per se? And I started thinking about the definition of a game at its core elements. So let me bounce this off you guys. What if a game is not necessarily meant to be fun, but has 3 key elements? And the first one is a goal or objective for victory. This goal could be user-defined or system-defined or socially defined by others. The second would be a real-time scoring system to let you know how you're doing against that goal, and that feedback is instantaneous for you or visibly seen at all moments. And then the third element would be clear-cut rules on how your actions and decisions would influence that score. Notice I didn't say fun anywhere in those 3 elements. If I take those 3 elements as definition for a game, then it's actually pretty interesting to think that what in life is not a game? I would argue that how people file their income taxes under such a definition becomes a game, right? The implicit goal for some people is see how much they can kind of get away with not filing. The real objective is don't get thrown in jail. And you know, it's sort of a great implicit game in that sense. I'd say getting a job at the company you want to work for is a game in many ways. House hunting, finding a boyfriend or a girlfriend. These are all sorts of games in their own way. They're just implicit. What makes gamification more explicit is the transparent scoring in real time, and then the transparency of the rules around affecting the score. And there was a big lesson I found, which is if you're gonna score people, you gotta let them know how the rules work on if that score goes up or down. This is something, I'm a big fan of what cloud's trying to do, but they face this challenge all the time. Imagine that when you tune the algorithm, but you can't fully explain the algorithm, all those people who invested that time playing along with your score, they might get really pissed off if you change the algorithm on them because they feel that they don't know how the score works, right? Imagine credit scoring if there was no explanation of how credit scores work. People would just revolt, right? So that's a big element there is if you're going to score people and assign how they're doing, you've got to let them know how to influence that score and keep consistency in that to some degree. So that's one thing I'd like to try to do is to help the industry reframe what gamification is. It's not about necessarily making everything into a game per se or making unfun things fun, but perhaps it's more around instrumenting things so that you can measure, score, provide real-time feedback back to users, whether they're consumers or even employees, and then provide interactive sets of clear rules of how to influence that score up or down in moving that user towards a goal, whether that goal is self-defined, externally defined by a system, or socially defined by other users. So I think it is sort of a broadening of the scope and clarifying what the term gamification means. Ironically, another threat I think that could happen to gamification is that within a few years, it goes away. It actually dissipates into other fields like CRM, loyalty systems, behavioral analytics, social infrastructure, social marketing, marketing automation. It could be that just like the fields of social or mobile, they lose meaning. Think of it this way, what today is not mobile? What doesn't have a social element? So instead of being a standalone industry, perhaps it becomes a fabric of functionality that gets weaved into everything. And it gets weaved into everything in a seamless way so that you don't see it so overtly. Could be that gamification ends up going everywhere and you stop noticing it because it becomes such an effective framework that it gets integrated into other existing applications and services in a pretty effective way. So in that sense, the ultimate win for gamification is that it may stop being such a hot trend because it just becomes standard frameworks that people use in everyday design thinking. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on the opportunities for the industry. But I would say the number one threat today for what we all need to do to make gamification industry is focusing on actual ROI and case studies of success. Right? That's probably the number one thing the naysayers are looking for is how do you know if it works? How do you measure it? If gamification is about scoring, how do you score the success of a well-implemented gamification program? So I think that's what people are looking for next. Everybody's bought into the potential and the hype. Everybody is willing to try a gamification project, but where the acid test really kicks in, where you know if it's a real business or not, is if companies renew licenses for gamification systems when that first year is expired, when that initial pilot is over, and somebody asks, was it a success? Can they point to some metric that says, hey, I got some payback out of this thing? Doesn't have to be financial. Could be engagement, could be new users added, could be social, could be any other metrics. But the point is, you have to have something that defines whether or not it was a success. Otherwise, these things end up relegated into sort of one-off, experimental, or hype-based pilots that don't lead to something else. And that's what you always want to be aware of. Right now, we're in the state that you can sell gamification projects into any client because they're willing to believe in the promise. But the real test for all of us is to get the renewal and the upsell after that pilot program is over. And believe it or not, this is the same thing, this ROI issue, that's faced every major category of enterprise software when it first came around. CRM, back in the day, not everybody bought into. Not everybody actually thought things like Salesforce.com actually worked. And so it was incumbent upon these kinds of companies, even in enterprise software, which are well accepted now, to handhold their clients and even tell them what the metrics of success were, handhold them in setting these things up, even have large professional services organizations to set up, teach, come in, tune, tweak, even sometimes run these things for the customers. So I think that's actually going to be the case for gamification as well. A lot of us are saying, hey, here's some self-service toolkits, go do it yourself. But people don't really want self-service tools. They kind of want you to tell them what to do, and in many cases, they'll even pay you 10 times more than the tool pricing for you to do it for them. Case in point, this is very true for the analytics industry. When analytics first came out, a lot of people bought into the promise. They would get their Omniture license or whatnot, it'd be self-service, but then they found, man, I'm not sure what to measure or how to set it up. So I remember once an Omniture salesperson telling me their special sauce was actually going in after the sale and coming in every few months and saying, how's your implementation going? They would even track the usage to say, you know what? You're actually not getting the most out of your system because it's not set up right. And for an extra $1,000 an hour, we'll come in and set it up for you. So it was actually an upsell even for the services part of it. And interestingly, when you asked a lot of early Omniture customers how many of them thought they were getting full usage out of it, less than 50% said they would, that they were getting the full value. Then they would even say, oh, but that's because Omniture told us that we're not using it in the proper way and we're not fully taking advantage of all the different features. So we're going to not only renew, we're going to buy those extra modules they told us we needed to use, right? So I think gamification will follow a very similar path if there's not a focus on the ROI, the success metrics after you've implemented it. Right now, like I said, we're in a phase where all companies want to try a pilot, but you got to get to that real ROI. So for companies playing in the space, can't just offer a toolkit. The services component, the consulting, the professional managed services groups that are coming in telling you how to set it up, implement it, even run it for your customers is just as critical as the tools and the technologies themselves, right? I think if we offer gamification just as a self-service toolkit, the know-how is the part that's missing. And did you ever notice? Salesforce.com has built up a huge ecosystem of third-party consultants, developers, companies that specialize in applying Salesforce.com to specific verticals. That's kind of what the gamification industry needs next, and that is actually an opportunity, is we'll sprout entire ecosystems of vertical industry experts, advisors, consultants, system integrators who actually design, build, run, operate, and feed insights back to customers for this. And I think this is what's needed because until now, I've seen a lot of examples of, I'd call shallow or thin gamification. And that's where somebody reads about an article in TechCrunch, says, hey, I got to try this gamification stuff. Then they'll bolt on leaderboards, badges, points, and they just sort of slap it on as an afterthought. And that's the worst possible thing because gamification is not a silver bullet, it's not a panacea for a shitty site, and it's not good lipstick for a pig, if you will, right? The best gamification is done seamlessly, it's built into the core of the product and the experience, and it's aligned with the business goals. You don't just slap it on and hope that it fixes user engagement or conversion rates, and if it's slapped on, it looks really cheesy, and users see through it, and they develop an immunity to it, and they don't want to see any more of it. So that's why the know-how of how to apply gamification is probably even more important than the technologies and tools behind it right now. That's always true in embryonic new industries. It's that know-how. And like I said, it was the same for CRM, analytics, all these other fields as well. So let's talk about the opportunities. Where are things going? In early days of gamification, we saw a lot of companies try to use game mechanics into their sites, services, and apps. And the initial verticals that I've seen so far have been health and wellness, big overlap here with quantified self, by the way, that whole measured life field you've heard about. Similarly with fitness and nutrition, education has been a big target for gamification. Education always has been unfun, so people want to try to see if they can make it more fun or motivating. But I'm also thinking other areas that are not quite as obvious: financial services, investing, stocks, things like that. But actually where I think it really gets unlocked is when you apply gamification into enterprise software. So it's when you take existing fields and tools like CRM, HRM, right, customer service solutions, all those things, and add game mechanics into them to make them a little more usable, more engaging, more delightful. One example I like to give, who here has used Salesforce.com or other standard enterprise software interfaces? You ever notice these things? They're built for utility. So the first time you log in, you're just overwhelmed by fields, tabs, buttons, pages, and you need to be trained on the system. What if we took a gaming-like approach, or even a really good, Apple consumer product-like approach, and had enterprise apps and software that didn't need training, didn't need a manual, didn't need tutorials, software that had adaptive UI that taught users how to use the product as you went along, just like a good social game does. Look at any of Zynga's new games. It teaches you the interface as you go. Instead of overwhelming you with every button, every possible field on the dashboard from the first moment, what it says is as soon as you come in, big yellow arrow, press here. You press it, it goes bing, and you go from 0 to 10 points, and explains what that element of the UI is. As you go on to the next thing, the next big yellow arrow introduces a new element to the UI. So it's actually adaptive UI that teaches by doing, as opposed to FAQ screens, tutorial screens, all those sorts of things, right? I think that's the opportunity for gamifying enterprise software and enterprise apps, is to make these UIs adaptive, to make them sort of scored and real time in terms of their feedback, and give end users even a little bit more delight in using the tool itself, right? So that is something I view as pretty interesting. The third is, I actually think gamification will lead to a whole new ecosystem of jobs and, if you will, sort of complementary types of companies, like gamification design shops, consultancies, advisories, system integrators, analytics, measurement companies, all these sorts of things. Because like I said, it is a toolkit, and toolkits rely on know-how of the tools to make them effective, right? One of the worst examples of gamification is just to take a leaderboard. If you just use a leaderboard, it's kind of like looking at a toolkit and saying, I only have a hammer, therefore everything looks like a nail. Let's go smash everything with our hammer. That's kind of like saying leaderboards is the one mechanic for gamification. Let's apply it everywhere, without realizing downsides that for every one game mechanic you could select, there's pros and cons of it, and that a certain game mechanic applies for a certain type of user profile. Leaderboards, as an example, only applies to the top maybe 10% of users who are hyper-competitive, often male, often younger, often who like to pwn each other and make fun of each other. And if you don't realize that the leaderboard, the universal leaderboard, actually scares off new users because you see it and you realize, man, I'm never getting to 10 million points. I don't even want to engage in that. Then you will have ended up being guilty of just using a hammer without realizing there's other tools like screwdrivers and everything else in there. So where the opportunity is to, I think, develop gamification as a full-blown toolkit, and to hone the understanding of each of the tools, where they apply, the pros and cons of each, the user psychographics that fit each of these types of mechanics, and this is going to spawn a whole set of know-how and companies and consultancies that specialize in that. Just like Salesforce.com grew a whole ecosystem of people who are experts in their specific verticals, and then offered those services and know-how to apply Salesforce.com in a verticalized fashion just for that industry. I think we'll see the same thing for gamification. Already, I've actually seen companies that are mimicking, the Badgevilles and the Bunchballs of the world, but just for certain verticals. I've heard pitches like, oh, we are Bunchball just for the health industry, or we're Badgeville just for the travel industry. So you'll start to see vertical specialization there as well. And then you'll start to even see what I'm going to call gamification as a service. And that means that it could actually be a professional services-based kind of industry. I guess one analogy, do you guys remember when websites first came up, we had web consultancies, Razorfish, Scient, Viant, Organic, all these sorts of folks, because a lot of people didn't know what to put on websites. So entire agencies had to come up, interactive agencies, to teach people what to build on their websites and actually build it for them and manage it for them. Gamification probably needs that in the first couple of years as we're all learning what this toolkit can really do. So I'm hoping that this is going to create a lot of employment opportunities, because right now, even the Badgeville's of the world, when people ask for the system integration, there's not a whole directory of people to point to say, hey, go use these guys. They're the best in the telecom industry for applying gamification. So we're going to sprout an entire sort of ecosystem of these complementary businesses. We'll probably even have someday job titles like gamification designers. And already I'm seeing demand for people coming out of the Zyngas of the world, the Platums of the world, the Omnitures of the world, who've grown up on these different game mechanics, know how to leverage analytics and insights and design for sort of game mechanics in these other settings. So that would be potentially one of the hottest job categories coming up, is for people who've come out of games industry or enterprise software who picked up some of this analytics focus to be known as gamification designers. So keep an eye out for that. And then, like I said, for companies, what I think will happen is just like for data miners and analytics, every single company out there right now is trying to hire data scientists and quant jocks, as we call them in the vernacular. Unfortunately, the supply of available employees with this skill set nowhere near matches the demand for that. So you're seeing this rising gap of the number of companies and the number of hiring needs for these sort of analytics quant jocks versus the actual supply. That gap is growing, and it may never be met. I think the same thing will happen in gamification. So another opportunity is, what if you became a premier think tank of the best gamification designers, quant jocks, et cetera, in a particular field? You could offer that service as gamification as a service, not just a toolkit, right? And that's something that'll probably even happen in the data science and analytics fields as well. Gamification analytics have a lot in common that way. To me, gamification in many ways is behavioral analytics with applied interactive rule sets for it. What I'm trying to do with this as well, I do a lot of lecturing and guest teaching, and I've been working with Wharton and Stanford on developing gamification curriculums, because I think if we do our jobs right, like I said before, gamification may go away over time as a term, and it'll just become a standard framework and lens that everyone uses in their different fields. So I'm hoping that gamification ultimately becomes just sort of a toolkit that pervades design thinking in the fields of UI, UX design, and community shaping, habit formation, habit breaking. A lot of it will feed into, I think, emotional and psychological engineering. Where I see and apply gamification a lot these days, you've heard of the freemium business model. Freemium now is the sort of business model du jour for everything from consumer, commerce, gaming, all the way to enterprise software. The conversion points along the freemium curve, those triggers, those are often very gamified and often driven by psychological engineering. And where I think gamification will have its biggest impact on business models is in evolving the art of what I call buy it or earn it, right? There's only two things you want your users to do. You want it to convert, and you want them to either pay for something, or you want them to do work for you and earn that value. Earning that value, that earn it part is the cusp of a whole bunch of new innovation. We haven't even scratched the surface yet. Earn it could be watch this ad, tell the advertiser what you think. Earn it could be tweet this, share this, invite friends. Earn it could be convert some of your users to make a purchase. Earn it could be come back 10 weeks in a row and tell us what you think of this new content. The earn it part is all the things that can be gamified beyond just purchasing something, and that's extra value to be extracted from users. We often say in freemium, at best, you get 10% of free users to pay for something. Well, it doesn't mean the other 90% are deadbeats. It's just that those 90% can be mined to do work for you and earn value or goods in other ways, and that's where gamification can be really powerful. So overall, like I said, this opportunity, I think, is for gamification to go away, but in the sense that it goes everywhere and becomes sort of a framework and a toolkit that we all use. With that, I've got a couple minutes for Q&A, and I thought I would open up if any folks had any questions about what us venture capitalists are seeing in this field. Yep, sure.
My name is Vitaly. I am an entrepreneur, and my company is developing a CRM game. My question is how to become your partner. How to become your partner. if you're investor and you make investments in companies that develop products, what is important for you and for your colleagues to become your partner to raise investments?
Well, there's a couple ways to look at it. There's one, a partner in the sense of supplying to our portfolio companies, right, or being a business partner there. Look at some of our portfolio companies like a Badgeville or Gigya or whatnot, and they would be natural potential channel partners for you, especially if you specialize in a certain functionality or a vertical that those platform players can't really focus on deeply. That's one aspect. If you're looking for investment, like I said, there's generally 3 business models we're looking for in gamification. Either site services apps that use gamification to serve consumers or enterprise workers, or second, platforms like a Bunchball, Badgeville, Gigya serving businesses, or third, this new area, like I said, gamification as a service type companies that are looking to serve the market. So I would say refine sort of the pitch along those 3, and then we're looking for killer teams that are deep in this space.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, my name is Tom.
Yep.
I know the gaming world is ready for Earn It because it's been experienced through social games even.
Yep.
I mean, is gamification, are brands in the world ready to understand the concept of earning or Earn It? I mean, we're actually working with a loyalty platform and we're using the concept of earning something.
Yep.
It's pretty hard for actual brands to understand that concept. They're still moving through how many likes I got, how many fans I got, how many tweets.
Yep.
So it's a big challenge right now.
I agree. But keep in mind, even Facebook is facing this too, trying to justify what's the value of a like or a fan. The easiest way to do this is if you can impute back to an actual metric they already track to today. For example, cost per lead, cost per acquisition, cost per paying customer, churn, all those sorts of things you can probably back into. And the more that you can kind of draw that connection, the more you'll be on metrics they already operate towards today. And that's actually one of the best principles for gamification design. Find out which metrics the company already operates on today, and then try to then use the gamification systems to see how they can back into those existing metrics, and then potentially add new metrics for things they might not be measuring yet, like, for example, repeat engagement rates, retention, conversions, kind of social remarketing, all those sorts of areas. So, case in point, if you're saying to a brand like Coke, I can get you 32 likes, that's great, even better. By the way, 1 like is worth $0.38 because of this, or it equals a conversion rate to purchase of XYZ, those sorts of things. Try to tie it back to existing metrics they operate under.
Great, thanks.
Hey, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks.